The green room smelled like old carpet and coffee that had been sitting since morning. It was 1973, and Jackson Browne was 24 years old, sitting in a chair that wasn't quite comfortable, looking at a piece of paper in his hand. The paper had a name on it. A warning, really, though not written like one. More like a suggestion. More like a prayer disguised as advice. His manager had just left. The words hung in the air after him, settling somewhere between encouragement and dread. Don't do it. That's what people kept saying. Not in those exact words, but the meaning was clear. Jackson knew some of these people. He knew other musicians who had been on the road, who understood what it meant to be in a band's shadow, to be the opening act, to be the one nobody came to see. He knew what the toll could be. But this was the Eagles. This was Don Henley and Glenn Frey, and the music was good. The opportunity was real. The money was steady. And he was young enough to believe he could handle anything. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. The thing about being in your 20s is that you think warnings are just older people being cautious. You think fear is something that happens to other people. You think you're different. You think you can manage the things that break other people because you're made of something stronger. Or maybe just because you haven't yet learned that strength isn't about how much you can take. Strength is knowing when to say no. And Jackson Browne, at that moment in his life, didn't know that yet. The tour started in the fall. The places blurred together. Small cities, medium cities, large cities. Venues that smelled like thousands of people who had already forgotten the opening act. Jackson would play his songs he had written himself, songs that meant something to him, songs that came from a real place in his chest, and he would watch the crowd. Some of them listened, some of them waited for the main event. Some of them went to get beer. This was the contract nobody tells you about. When you agree to open for someone, you agree to be the warm-up. You agree to be competent but forgettable. You agree to make the room ready for someone else's magic, and if you're not careful, if you're not strong in a way that has nothing to do with your voice or your guitar, you can start to believe that you are warm-up, that you are forgettable, that the magic belongs only to other people. Glenn Frey was a professional. Don Henley was a professional. They had a record that was climbing. They had a look. They had a sound that was exactly what radio wanted in those years. They were going to be huge. Everyone could feel it. And Jackson Browne, who was talented, who was thoughtful, who was writing songs that would matter for decades, was the person standing on stage before they came out. The money was good, though. That was real. Tour money, even for an opening act, was better than struggling in Los Angeles, playing small clubs, hoping someone would listen. Jackson had that hunger. Not the hungry for fame kind, but the hungry for survival kind. The kind that makes you say yes when you should be listening to the warnings. The pressure started small. It always does. On stage, you can feel the difference between an audience that wants to be there and an audience that is bored and waiting. You can feel it in the silence. You can feel it in the way people check their watches or look at their phones or talk to the person next to them. Jackson felt all of it. He played his songs anyway. He played them with everything he had. But everything he had wasn't what they came for. Backstage, the Eagles were nice to him. This is important. They weren't cruel. They weren't dismissive. Don Henley and Glenn Frey were professional men doing a job. They probably didn't even think much about who was opening for them. They had their own pressures, their own moments of doubt, their own things they were trying to prove. They were just two guys who had a gift for writing songs that people wanted to hear, and they were going to perform those songs night after night. But the dynamic of a tour, any tour, creates its own gravity. The headliner is the sun, and everything else orbits around it. The opening act is a moon with no light of its own. Even if no one is being deliberately cruel, even if everyone is being professional and respectful, the structure itself tells you something about your value. Night after night, city after city. You play for 45 minutes. They play for 2 hours. You walk off stage to polite applause. They walk off to thunder. After a few weeks, something starts to happen inside you. It's not dramatic. It's not a moment where you decide you're worthless. It's quieter than that. It's a slow erosion. A question that starts small and grows. What if the people who warned you were right? Jackson began to notice things, the way the crowd seemed more alive after he left the stage, like they had been waiting for him to finish so the real show could begin. The way his songs, which had seemed so necessary to him when he wrote them, seemed to disappear the moment they were finished. The way he could give everything and it would still not be enough, because the thing that was being measured was not talent or heart or authenticity. The thing being measured was who people came to see. There's a particular kind of loneliness that happens on a stage in front of thousands of people. Jackson experienced it every night. He was surrounded by sound and light and attention, but none of it was for him. He was in a room full of people, and they were not seeing him. They were looking past him, looking through him, waiting for him to move so someone else could stand in his spot. The physical toll came next. Touring is exhausting. It's not just the performing. It's the travel, the sleeping in different beds, the food that's never quite right, the living out of suitcases, the being away from home. It's the constant motion that doesn't actually go anywhere. You end up in a different city, but the stage looks the same. The dressing room smells the same. The crowd reacts in the same basic ways. You're moving, but you're trapped. And then there's the psychological toll, the watching yourself fail, not fail in any technical sense. Jackson was a good performer. His songs were well constructed. He played his instrument skillfully, but he was failing at the thing the situation demanded, which was making people care. And that's a failure that is very hard to recover from, because it happens in front of witnesses every single night. You could see it happening to him. You could see it if you knew how to look. The way his movements became smaller, the way his voice, which had power, began to sound like he was apologizing, the way he would finish a song and not quite meet the eyes of the crowd as he moved to the next one. This is what happens when an environment tells you over and over that you don't matter. You start to believe it. The Eagles were probably aware that Jackson was struggling. You could tell just by being around. But what could they do? They had a tour scheduled. They had a record to promote. They had their own momentum to maintain. And Jackson had said yes. He had made a choice. It wasn't their responsibility to manage his feelings about being an opening act. That was his work to do. But the work was happening in a context where the context itself was hostile. The context was telling him every single night that he was not good enough. The context was telling him that his songs, his voice, his years of writing and learning and growing as an artist, all of it was something to be gotten through before the real thing happened. Weeks turned into months. The tour kept going. Different cities, same structure. Jackson kept playing. He kept showing up. He kept trying. This is the thing about being young and talented and broke. You don't have the luxury of quitting when something is damaging you. You have the luxury of enduring, and endurance can look like strength when you're watching it from the outside. But from the inside, it feels like drowning in slow motion. By the middle of the tour, something had shifted inside him. It wasn't a dramatic crisis. It was quieter. It was a kind of numbness mixed with desperation. He was still performing. His technical ability hadn't changed. But the spirit of it had changed. The thing that had driven him to write those songs in the first place, the need to communicate, to connect, to say something true, was being crushed under the weight of night after night of people not caring. The psychological impact of being invisible while visible is difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. You're in front of thousands of people. You're in the light. You're amplified. But you're not being seen. You're background music. You're something to sit through. You're the opening act. And after a while, you start to wonder if maybe you're just not as good as you thought. Maybe the people who warned you were right. Maybe you don't belong here. These thoughts are poison, but they're also insidious. They don't announce themselves. They don't come as a voice telling you that you're worthless. They come as questions, small doubts. the accumulation of evidence that seems to support a conclusion you don't want to reach. Jackson knew, somewhere in him, that this wasn't true. He knew that his songs were good. He knew that he had something to say. But knowing something in your head and believing it in your bones are two different things. And night after night on that tour, what he believed in his bones was that he didn't matter. The other thing that was happening beneath the surface was a kind of grief. Grief for the version of himself that had said yes to this tour. Grief for the excitement he had felt back before the tour started, when it had seemed like an opportunity instead of an ordeal. Grief for the belief he'd had in himself. Grief for all the nights he would never get back, all the songs he would play to people who would never remember hearing them. At some point, and it's not clear exactly when this happened, but at some point, something shifted. Jackson stopped fighting against the structure of the tour and started accepting it. This sounds like giving up, but it wasn't quite that. It was more like surrender. It was laying down arms you didn't know you were holding. When you stop fighting, sometimes the weight gets lighter. Not because the situation has changed, but because you're not using all your energy to resist it anymore. Jackson began to realize something. These people not caring wasn't about him. It was about them. They came to see the Eagles. That was fine. That was the deal he had made. He wasn't here to change their minds. He was here to play his songs and then leave the stage. His job wasn't to make them care. His job was to be professional, to do the work, to be there. This realization was both more peaceful and more painful. More peaceful because he could stop expecting something the structure was never designed to give. More painful because it meant accepting that this tour was not going to be the breakthrough he had hoped for. This was just a job, a difficult job, but a job. The tour continued. The dynamics didn't change. The crowds were still mostly indifferent. The Eagles were still professional and kind and completely separate from Jackson's internal struggles. But something in Jackson had shifted. He was still sad. He was still struggling. But he was no longer drowning in the water. He was treading it, and that small difference in his relationship to the situation made the rest of it survivable. There were moments, even in those difficult months, of grace. Moments when a few people in the crowd would really listen. Moments when he would remember why he loved making music. Moments when the songs would come alive, even if just for a few seconds, even if just for him and those few people who were really there. These moments were precious because they were rare, because they reminded him of something he was in danger of forgetting. And then, finally, the tour ended. Jackson Browne went back to Los Angeles. He went back to his life. He went back to writing songs. And the warning, which had seemed so vague and unhelpful when he heard it months before, suddenly made perfect sense. The warning had been right. The tour had been difficult. The experience had been painful in ways that were hard to articulate but very easy to feel. But here's the thing about difficult experiences. They become the material of art. Jackson didn't write his songs in a void. He wrote them in the context of his life, and his life included this tour. It included these months of invisibility. It included these nights of playing to people who didn't care. And something about surviving that, not enjoying it, not growing from it in some Instagram caption kind of way, but just surviving it and coming out the other side still willing to write and play, that became part of who he was as an artist. He could have been broken by it. Some people are. Some people go on a tour like that and decide that this dream is too difficult, too painful, too unrewarding, and they quit. They become lawyers or teachers or accountants. They write music at night for themselves for fun. And that's a perfectly good life. Nothing wrong with that. But Jackson didn't quit. He kept writing, he kept playing, and over time the thing that had seemed impossible, that people would care about his music, that he would have something to say that was worth hearing, became true. Not because the tour with the Eagles had been a success. It hadn't. But because he had survived it. Because he had learned something about endurance and about the difference between being heard and mattering. because he had learned that your value as an artist isn't determined by whether a crowd of strangers cares on any given night. Years later, Jackson Browne would become one of the most important singer-songwriters of his generation. He would write songs that would be covered by other artists and become standards. He would influence countless musicians who came after him. His name would be synonymous with a particular kind of emotional honesty and musical craft. And none of that erased the difficulty of that tour with the Eagles. But it meant that the difficulty had a context. It meant that he hadn't been broken by it. It meant that something inside him had been strong enough to survive. The people who had warned him about the tour, they were trying to protect him from pain. They understood from their own experience or observation that being an opening act for a major band could be psychologically damaging. They were right about that. The tour was difficult. It was painful. It did damage something in Jackson, at least temporarily. The warnings were accurate. But warnings can't protect you from everything. Sometimes you have to walk into the hard thing anyway, not because you're brave or foolish, but because you need the money, or you believe the opportunity might be worth it, or you're young enough to think you're invincible. And sometimes when you do that, you find out that you were right to be warned. The thing is as hard as they said it would be. Maybe harder, but you also find out something else. You find out that you can survive hard things. You find out that being broken and continuing anyway is possible. You find out that the damage isn't necessarily permanent, and that sometimes what looks like damage is actually just the beginning of growing something new. Jackson Browne finished that tour. He played his songs to crowds that mostly didn't care. He went back to Los Angeles. He kept writing. And gradually, over years, the warning became a memory. It became a story. It became a part of his history that had shaped him but hadn't defined him. And maybe that's what the people who warned him didn't understand or didn't want to say. The warning was accurate. The tour was difficult. But the difficulty was survivable, and surviving it was worth something. Not in a motivational poster kind of way, not in a way that makes the difficult nights worth it in some karmic balance, but in a quiet, real way, in the way that endurance changes you, in the way that pain, when you survive it, becomes knowledge, knowledge of yourself, knowledge of what you're made of, knowledge of what you can carry. The warning had been right. But Jackson had needed to discover that truth for himself, needed to walk into it and through it rather than accept it secondhand. Some things can only be learned by experience. Some truths can only be real to you if you've lived them yourself. Years pass. The people involved age. The tour becomes history. The warning becomes irrelevant because the thing it was warning against has already happened. And Jackson Browne sits in some green room, or maybe at home, and remembers those difficult months. And he knows, in a way that goes deeper than words, that the people who warned him were right. And he knows, in a way that goes deeper than words, that ignoring the warning was also right, that sometimes you have to learn some lessons by living through them, that sometimes you have to hear the warning and do it anyway, not out of pride or stupidity, but out of necessity, out of hunger, out of being young and having to discover your own limits by reaching for them. The Eagles went on to become one of the most successful rock bands of all time. Jackson Browne went on to become one of the greatest songwriters of his generation. They were both right. They both mattered. They both had something real to give. And for a few months in 1973, their paths crossed in a structure that wasn't designed to contain both of their truths. And from that impossible situation, something real emerged. Not the friendship that might have been, not the mutual success that might have been, but the survival of both, the continuation of both, the knowledge that you can be in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong structure, and still come out the other side still yourself. Still willing to create, still willing to believe, still willing to try again. That's what the warning didn't capture. That's what no one could have told Jackson Browne that would have made it less painful or more bearable. You have to walk into some things to understand them. You have to hear the warning and ignore it anyway. You have to discover through your own suffering what you're made of. And sometimes on the other side of that discovery, you find that you're stronger than you knew. Not in a way that makes the pain retroactively worth it, but in a way that makes the pain meaningful, transformative, real. And that's the story. Not a story of triumph, not a story of learning a lesson, just a story of a young man, a warning, a difficult tour, and the slow discovery that he could survive what was meant to break him, and that surviving it changed him into the person he was meant to become.